Welcome back, everybody. Now today I've got something very different. It's not a product review, but I guess you can kind of consider it a review decades after the fact. And that's my experience seeing a psychic 32 years ago who predicted my life ahead. And I thought it'd be fun to go back and look at those predictions and see how accurate they were. I've always been kind of a journaler, and this is my April through August 1991 journal. And on page 15 of that journal is the April 24th, 1991 entry where I went and saw a psychic. Now let me give you a little backstory before I get into the actual predictions here. April of 1991, I was 22, almost 23 years old. I was kind of unsure where my life was going. I had just graduated from college in November. I was starting grad school in September, so I really didn't know what was going on in my life. I was kind of broke. My parents were talking about moving to Las Vegas, which they did a year later. So I was kind of all over the place. So someone suggested I go see a psychic, and even though I was kind of skeptical, I said, why not? Maybe I'll get some answers about where my life is going. Now, to be clear, myself now at the age I am, I don't necessarily believe in psychics. No offense to those who do. I'm pretty skeptical, but I wasn't as skeptical back then, or I wouldn't have gone to it. Now, the person I went and saw was supposedly the only licensed psychic in the entire state of California in 1991. Apparently, the way I understand the story is that in the 1960s, they actually used to issue licenses for psychics. They stopped doing that, and she was the last one left that actually had a license. So that's how she got kind of grandmothered into the process. So the day of my psychic reading, I went home and wrote down extensively in my journal. This is my journal entry from 1991. So she had quite a few predictions, actually. So let's see how they panned out. Now, most of these were for my immediate and midterm future, not this far out. But I can definitely look back and see how those panned out. So here are my notes from my psychic adventure, April 91. When I first walked in, before I even said anything to her, she said, "You're an entertainer." So to me, that was pretty impressive, because I thought, wow, how does she know that? I was a musician, I was a music major. But looking back, I had long hair, I kind of looked like a musician. In fact, this is what I looked like around the same time. Not a stretch to guess I was a musician. So the first thing she did was ask for a metal possession. I took off my necklace, handed it to her. She starts rubbing it with her hands like this, and then she starts talking. She just kind of goes off, and later on I asked her some questions. So the first thing she said was that I'm generally a positive person. She said, you always try to be positive. Now keep that in mind for what she says later, because she contradicts that a little bit later on. Now, I do think I'm a positive person, but I probably gave that impression when I first met her, so maybe that isn't so much of a stretch. Then she said I was lonely even though I have a lot of friends. Now that's a bit of a general statement. It was probably true at the time, but I did have a lot of friends. But on the other hand, people are going to see psychics for a reason, because they have some struggles in their life, so maybe that isn't too much of a stretch either. But we'll keep going. She said, I've never been happy in relationships. Now, most people in their early 20s, isn't that the case? I mean, usually if you're not married, you've been unhappy in relationships because you haven't found the one yet, so. I'm still not convinced yet. Speaking of relationships, she went on, she said there were 2 relationships in my past that didn't work out the way I wanted, and I never understood why. So now at the time, I thought of my 2 most prominent relationships prior to that time, which hadn't worked out, so I thought, oh, that's a match. But couldn't that be said about any person's past relationships? You probably have more than 2 that didn't work out that you could think of, so. To me, I'm still not convinced. I feel like she's just taking generic stabs at it. All right, so here's where she contradicts herself. The next thing she said was, I have a lot of negative energy. Didn't she just say I was a generally positive person? Which one is it? So she went back to that negative energy thing several times, even though I'm a positive person. So I'm not sure if I'm negative or positive. I'm both. Maybe she didn't realize I was gonna write all this down later. So she kept talking about relationships. I wasn't even bringing it up. She kept talking about relationships. She said, my current relationship, when you say things to her, you're very clear, but she always seems to hear things differently. Isn't that the whole men are from Mars, women are from Venus thing? It's like, doesn't every relationship have that? So to me, she's still talking in generalities. I'm not getting anything specific. She does get very specific soon though. Once again, she kept saying I have negative energy even though I'm a positive person. She said I was going to marry the girl I was currently dating, which is funny because I broke up with her a month later and I never saw her again. I saw her once 20 years later. So she said I was going to marry that person. Totally wrong. Never saw that person again, except for once 20 years later. So that's definitely a big miss column on that one. This was 1991. She said I was gonna have 2 kids in the next 4 years. Well, I had 2 kids 7 years later. I don't think that's close enough. That's almost double. I think the 7 years is too far out of the margin of error for that to be right. She said once again I was an entertainer, which I had agreed earlier. So she already had been verified that was the case. She said I was an entertainer. Yes, I'm an entertainer. Now, the next thing she said is very specific. This is April of 91. She said, I'm going to move within a month and a half. I didn't move until June of 1994, so she was 3 years off on that one. I mean, I guess you could say I did move, but it's not that unusual for a 22-year-old to move in a couple years. She also said sooner or later I was going to go to grad school. I was already enrolled in grad school, so to me saying that I'm going to sooner or later go in there, I guess she's right. We'll give her one for that. We'll say she's right. Here's another good one. She said by the end of 1991, I was going to sign a big contract. She didn't say what the contract was for, but she said I was going to sign a big contract. And I have a quote here for her, actually an actual quote from the psychic. She said, "At first it will be misleading, but you'll be confident when you sign it." That just did not happen. I was broke in 1991. I was broke for the next several years. By the end of the year I was in grad school, I was completely broke. I didn't sign any contract, anything like that. There was no contracts. I limped out to Vegas 3 years later and started over again. There was no contract. And I wasn't, if I had signed a contract, I don't think I would have been confident. All right, we got a couple more here. She said, I got a quote here. She said, "Your parents are very successful, but they made some mistakes along the way and could have been more successful." Now, to me, that sounds like generic fishing for yeses on that one. What's funny is my parents were successful, but I don't remember them making any mistakes. In fact, I would say they overachieved at that point. I think that they were far more successful at that time than they thought they were going to be. So to say they made mistakes, that's the opposite of true. That is not true. And the last thing that she said was that someone I worked with was jealous of me. Well, what's funny is I work for my parents, and the only person I work with was my brother-in-law. And my brother-in-law and I were pretty close. She then said, "This person wishes you would keep your personal life to yourself." And that just wasn't true either. He and I knew each other's personal lives well. We were in the same family. We were together all the time. That was not true. So to me, looking back, it looks like she made a lot of vague statements, a lot of educated guesses. There were a few hits in there, but there was also quite a few misses. I would say looking back 32 years later, she really wasn't very accurate. Nor was it particularly useful in guiding me in where our life was going. In fact, it was, if anything, it was probably confusing. I wasn't moving, I wasn't signing a big contract, I wasn't having kids in a couple years. All that was wrong. Maybe for some reason, those false answers gave me some sort of comfort. But to me, that psychic 32 years ago was inaccurate. So that was my experience with a psychic 32 years ago. If you guys have ever seen a psychic, I would be interested in seeing what you have to say about them in the comments below. I appreciate you watching, and I'll see you next time.